Well, earlier this afternoon, the leader of the EFF, Julius Malema, said his party included demands around the expropriation of land in negotiations around administrations and councils because councils have the power to expropriate land. He was explaining today that so far the EFF has not come to any agreements about forming coalitions with anyone on a formal basis. Professor Elmien du Plessis is a professor of law. She studied the land question extensively. She's at the University of Northwest. She joins us now. Professor, good afternoon to you. Whenever we talk about the expropriation of land, we sort of have in our head farmland and national government. Actually, I suppose expropriation is something a council does more often. So can a council expropriate land?
So yes, I think one must also start to distinguish between expropriation, for instance, for normal everyday things like building a road, building a school, etc., which is sort of what we always knew the powers of expropriation to be for. But the 1994 Constitution makes it quite, or 1996 Constitution, sorry, makes it quite clear that expropriation can happen also for land reform purposes. So that's the broader public interest. And then specifically in this context, I think it's Section 9(3) of the Housing Act gives the power to local municipality to expropriate land to use for housing purposes. So in that sense, Mr. Malema is quite correct in saying that municipalities can expropriate land. I think he added to that that the debate is rather whether they must compensation for that or not. That's the contentious issue, not the issue that they do have the power to expropriate the land.
If a council wants to expropriate land, does it have to serve a particular purpose? I remember during the Gautrain, I think when that was being constructed in Gauteng, I think there were one or two properties that were sort of expropriated there or came close to it.
Yes, so when the state, then in whatever form, in this case the local municipality, expropriate land, it must do so for a very specific purpose. So that purpose also restricts the state's power to expropriate because it's quite an invasive state power to take away people's private property. And in that sense, it serves as a justification. So the state cannot just take any property and not have a plan of what to do with it. It's a little bit murky at the moment as to what extent a court, for instance, can interrogate this purpose. But in terms of the Constitution, at least, it's quite clear that there must be a specific purpose for this expropriation. And I would argue, if this was my argument to make, that Section 9(3) of the Housing Act then sets out what that purpose can be. So that's a sort of accountability mechanism to make sure that the municipality is expropriated for that specific purpose and then also use it for that specific purpose. I think that's also very important.
So again, in the national debate around expropriation without compensation, what that normally means is that land would be expropriated and then a group of other people would live on that land. I'm going to come to sort of what happens to the land after expropriation, but the purpose is a sort of form of restitution, or the purpose is for people who don't have land to use that land. Would a council be able to do that, or would it only be able to do it for housing? And I realize housing might mean the same thing, but it also, once the lawyers get through with it, means something else.
So there are various pieces of legislation that authorizes or that sets a certain, so again, my argument that sets a certain public purpose there. So you have the Restitution Act that says, in the case that somebody is successful in a restitution claim, then the minister in that case can expropriate the property to, fulfill that claim. And the same is here for housing. And you can perhaps, ask, well, is this on what basis are we going to ensure that the housing people get access to housing? Will this remain municipal housing? Are we going to transfer title deeds to people? There's quite a little bit of controversy, especially in foreign law, not so much in South Africa, that the state cannot usually expropriate land and then hand it over to private individuals, but it must be able to happen in South Africa if we are going to do land reform. So I think those specifics needs to be determined. So I have actually done a quick Google search before today's talk just to see how far we've come, because in academics we haven't really seen the municipality using its powers in terms of Section 9(3) of the Housing Act to expropriate land in order to provide housing for people. But there seems to be quite a few of these notices served in the Durban municipality or the metro there. So, it is starting to become a mechanism for the municipality to get access to land, and, a good argument can, for instance, be made that land that is suitable, that's close to job opportunities, that's close to good schools, etc., should be targeted by a municipality in order to provide housing for people, because there's enough research that show that that will help people out of poverty. So there are many things that the municipality can do with this Section 9.3 if they have the will to do it. But I think, you know, the frustration for somebody that's a lawyer is the law only creates the framework. The law doesn't do the thing. So the law creates the framework in which these contestations can take place, but it doesn't do it. And I think it's important for the municipalities to start to do these things so that we can see how that can play out and how we can utilize the law to bring about housing for people.
Professor, you followed the expropriation argument, the debates around it more closely than just about anyone, particularly on the legal side. And you'll know there's a huge fight between the ANC and the EFF on what happens to land that is expropriated. So the ANC's view is that that land would be given to someone. You've already alluded to that. That person would have tenure. So if they passed away, that land would literally go to their children. Their children would inherit the land, and that would be a form of restitution. The EFF wants land to be expropriated, so taken from people without compensation, and then be held by the state, so nationalized. Now, where does a council fit in with all of this? So I can see a council having their cake and eating it all, having their land and using it rather, because they might be able to say, well, we'll control the land and use it to provide housing. So then the EFF gets everything at once.
Yeah, so I think the more frustrating part here is, the EFF proposes custodianship, which can be different than nationalization. It depends on how it's constructed. And there's not a lot of detail on exactly what that would look like. If we are going to expropriate land, and then the state will be custodian, and we all have to apply for the use of certain properties, be it my own house or other land to use. So it will be based on people's needs, a needs-based approach, if I understand it correctly. You know, will it be the local municipalities that control this permit system or this custodianship system? It depends, again, exactly how that will work. Or will there be a central, you know, land authority that determines centrally who gets what land in whatever metro? So that is not clear. I must say what I did disagree with that Mr. Malema said is he said, well, the Constitution, there's a national understanding is important. It's important to have a national approach to this expropriation in municipalities because there must be uniformity. And I think that goes a little bit against our idea of what a cooperative government is and what it means to give municipalities some degree of autonomy to decide how they do things. So you can have sort of a policy or indication what you envision, but I think that idea that things must be nationally centralized, you know, that sends certain messages, if I can say it that way, that does make one feel a little bit uneasy. For instance, if the land will then be expropriated and placed under custodianship, will it be a national authority that determines who gets access to what land, and how will they know? Or will it be the municipality, which might be better suited to do that? But again, these are all just preliminary thoughts because there's no detail in these conversations. So it's difficult to comment if the detail is not out there.
Professor Elmien du Plessis, thanks very much indeed. Professor of Law at the University of Northwest. Yes, someone understands the law around land.